Hi everyone. Today's video lesson is going to be day 2 of the Cold War in the East. It is lesson 1.03. This follows our previous lesson, which was 1.03 Cold War in the East, day 1, where we focused on China and Japan. And today's video lesson is going to focus on Korea and specifically the Korean War. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of why the Korean War happened. We're going to talk a little bit about what happened during the Korean War. We're going to talk about how the Korean War ended, and we're going to talk about why the Korean War was important to the Cold War as a whole. So sort of what kind of precedents did the Korean War set for the rest of the Cold War? So for those of you who might be big military history buffs who like to know about all the movements of the troops and everything during the wars, we're not really going to get into that. It's basically going to be focused on the causes and effects of the Korean War with a little bit of what actually happened during the Korean War mixed in there. So Korea is on your screen on your right. It is located on the Korean Peninsula. It is south of China and it is bordered by the Sea of Japan and the Yellow Sea. So that is where Korea is located in the world. After World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel. And the 38th parallel is this line right here that you can see that is dividing North Korea from South Korea. After World War II, when it was divided at the 38th parallel, the Soviet armies occupied the northern half and the U.S. forces occupied the southern half of Korea. Now, eventually, these two halves, became two separate countries. North Korea became communist and South Korea became non-communist. In June of 1950, the Korean War began, and it began when North Korean troops, without any warning, poured across the border into South Korea. So you can see here, North Korea is on this map in pink, and in June of 1950, North Korean troops poured over the border and came into South Korea. They were able to capture the South Korean capital city, which is Seoul, which is located right here. Now, the goal of these North Korean troops was to unite the Korean Peninsula by force and to unite it under communism. So what this means is that the goal of North Korea in June of 1950, when they sent their troops across the border into South Korea, their goal at the end of this is that they did not want to have a North Korea and a South Korea anymore. They wanted to have Korea, but they wanted it to be a communist Korea. So the goal of the North Koreans was to unite the peninsula under communism. Now, the North Koreans were not doing this alone. They did have help from Stalin. Remember, Stalin at the time is the leader of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is a large world superpower, and it is a communist world superpower. And remember, during the Cold War, the goal of the Soviet Union was to spread communism around the world. So this is why they are going to help North Korea, because if North Korea were to win this Korean War, then they would be able to overtake South Korea and spread communism to South Korea. So Stalin helped by supplying money, planes, and pilots, but he did not commit any troops. So no Red Army or no Soviet troops were committed to the conflict that was going on in Korea. So now that this happened and North Korea came across into South Korea and a communist country was threatening to spread communism to a non-communist country, President Truman had a choice to make. Did he face war with the Soviet Union to defend a peninsula halfway around the world? Or did he let this invasion go? And if he let this invasion go, how would any nation that bordered a communist nation feel safe? So here, remember that idea of containment, that foreign policy of the United States? This is the first time that that idea of containment is really put to the test. Like, is Truman going to send troops to contain communism when communism threatened to spread, like the policy of containment says that he is going to do? So what is Truman to do here? And remember, Truman is president of the United States at the time. Well, Truman decides to go to the United Nations. Remember, the United Nations was developed after World War II with the hopes of helping to solve international problems diplomatically without going to war. So this seems like the perfect time to use the United Nations. So Truman took the situation to the United Nations. When the Korean matter came up for discussion, the Soviet delegates were nowhere to be found. They were nowhere around. Remember, the Soviet Union was backing up those North Korean troops. The Security Council did pass a resolution condemning the invasion and authorizing the use of force to drive the North Koreans out of the South. So when we're talking about the Korean War, it is officially the United Nations and not the United States that went to war with North Korea, although U.S. soldiers were sent to Korea to fight with other United Nations troops. So again, we said in the Cold War that the United States and the Soviet Union never directly fought each other, but they fought sort of with each other in these proxy wars where they were fighting through other countries. So the United Nations is going to join the war against North Korea. So it'll be the United Nations under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, and you probably remember him from our discussions about Japan after World War II. But General Douglas MacArthur was approved by the United Nations Security Council to head the UN troops in Korea. And he organized some of the most daring maneuvers in modern military history. And one of these maneuvers is the Incheon invasion. And this involved 261 ships that landed at the South Korean city of Incheon. This city was supposed to be invulnerable to attack because it's completely surrounded by cliffs that border the ocean. So no one thought that they would be able to land there and invade from that city. So the North Koreans were taken by surprise. They were pushed out of Seoul, South Korea, which was the capital, and they were turned back north. And during this time, the United Nations forces used Japan as a staging area. And because they were using Japan as a staging area during the Korean War actually helped to get Japan's economy going again. Now, General MacArthur, he was commanding troops for the United Nations, but since he was a U.S. general, President Truman was still the commander-in-chief of MacArthur. And President Truman told MacArthur that he needed to stop at the original border at the 38th parallel and not go any further north into North Korea than the 38th parallel. So remember, the Incheon invasion was here. They pushed the North Korean troops out of Seoul, South Korea, back into North Korea, and Truman told MacArthur he needed to stop at the 38th parallel and not go any further. The 38th parallel is the green line on the map. Well, MacArthur ignored the president and went across the 38th parallel and went deep into North Korean territory. And here, this blue line right here is actually as far north as the UN and U.S. forces under MacArthur were able to advance. By November of 1950, they were able to get up here north in North Korea to where this blue line is. Now remember, China at this point is a communist nation. Remember, they became communist after that civil war. Mao is the leader of communist China. And as you can see on the map, China shares a border with North Korea. So China started to get alarmed at the fact that the United States and the United Nations were pushing so far north into North Korea. And what does that mean for China? Does that mean they're going to keep coming into communist China? Well, China got a little bit alarmed by this, and they sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops into the war. These troops came into North Korea, they came across the Yalu River, and they began to push the United States and the UN forces back south towards South Korea. The UN troops actually found themselves fighting for their lives. And because of this retreat, General MacArthur, remember, he defied President Truman by going north of the 38th parallel to begin with. He was fired by President Truman for insubordination. So what do you think? General MacArthur defied the president. He had the U.S. and UN troops pretty much running for their lives from the Chinese. how do you think that he was welcomed home after he was fired by the president? Well, MacArthur, came back to the United States, and he was actually treated as a hero. He returned home to a hero's welcome, even though he was just fired by the president. He was loved by many, many people in the United States. And the pictures on the screen here, you can see the parades that he was welcomed home with and the speeches he was giving as a hero when he came home after being just fired by the president. Now, we'll get to the ending of the Korean War in just a second, but one thing that did happen while the Korean War was going on was that Stalin died. Remember, Stalin is the leader of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the Cold War, and what you'll see as we continue talking about the Cold War over the next 3 units is you'll see that both the United States and the Soviet Union are going to go through a lot of different leaders. Remember, the Cold War lasts 44 years, so there are many different leaders that are going to be leading both countries during the Cold War. Stalin was the first one to lead the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And in March of 1953, Stalin was at a villa outside Moscow with his closest advisors. His advisors had come to learn that really no one was safe around Stalin. Stalin's bodyguards found him one morning in his bedroom. He was unable to speak. Official reports said that he died of a stroke. He actually died 4 days after his bodyguards found him, but many historians believe that he may have actually been poisoned. So Stalin died during the Korean War. The Korean War was going on when Stalin died. The Korean War is going to come to an end on July 27th, 1953, and it's going to be an armistice that will bring an end to the fighting of the Korean War. Now, this is not a peace treaty because nothing was settled, but the fighting stopped. At the end of the Korean War, 3 million people were dead or missing. Korea remained divided at the 38th parallel, the exact same spot that it was divided at before the Korean War started. North Korea remained communist, just like it was before the Korean War, and South Korea remained a capitalist nation, again, just like it was before the Korean War began. So while it may seem like nothing changed as a result of the Korean War, the war was actually a very important part of the Cold War in general. First of all, Truman demonstrated to the Soviet Union his commitment to containing communism at any cost. Remember, he sent 3 million U.S. troops to Korea in order to fight to stop communism from spreading to South Korea. Another precedent that it set, or another reason that the Korean War was important in the context of the entire Cold War, was the fact that Truman set the precedent for avoiding the use of nuclear weapons. Remember, the United States has nuclear weapons. They used them before on Japan to end World War II. And MacArthur actually wanted to use nuclear weapons against the North Koreans and the Chinese during the Korean War, but Truman refused to do so. So early on in the Cold War, Truman set the precedent that he would not use nuclear weapons during the Cold War, and this was probably a very good precedent to set, because as you know, the Soviet Union will eventually obtain nuclear or develop nuclear weapons of their own. So, as some of you may remember from first semester, before I became a teacher, I actually worked in the Senate in Washington, D.C., and one of the things I really liked to do during my free time was go around and look at the different memorials that are in Washington, D.C., and the Korean War does have a memorial to it there in Washington. It was dedicated on July 27th, 1995. The Korean War Memorial, and you do not need to know any of this information about the memorial for a quiz or a test. It's just sort of fun facts for you. It's made up of 19 statues that are made of stainless steel. The different statues are different ethnicities of the soldiers who fought in the Korean War. They are dressed in full combat gear with ponchos that cover their weapons and equipments, just like they would have worn during the Korean War. There's also this support wall right here that has 2,400 pictures etched into it of the doctors, nurses, stretcher bearers, reporters, radio communications personnel, and even the Canine Corps. And the reason that these 19 statues are important, because 19, they reflect into the wall, plus 19 is 38, right where Korea is divided at the 38th parallel.